This draft feels about as important as any draft has felt in, I don't know, do we go back a decade for this Flyers team? I mean, it really, so much of what Danny Briere and Keith Jones have done together to this point has really pointed them in this direction. And so the Flyers enter this draft as currently constituted with 3 first-round picks and 4 second-round picks. I find it very hard to believe they're going to make all 7 of those picks. Danny Briere and Brent Flair did kind of acknowledge that, of course, there's a possibility, but likely they're going to make a move, or they're going to make at least one. Maybe they'll move up, maybe they'll move down. Could they stay at 6? Could they move up from 22? Could they package together 22 and 31 and move up to a player who might be falling? So I want to go over a bunch of different scenarios with you. But the one thing that I think is probably important to kind of get here for context is when it comes to prospects, I'm not watching these guys for the most part. Like you do. I don't. So I also don't fake having watched film. I feel like this draft has had more volatility to it in the last 6 months to a year than any I can remember in recent memory. It typically feels like there's that tier 1 list of players. They're locked in for a good long while. 4 or 5 months out, everybody has a general idea of who the top, let's say 5 or 6 picks are. Somebody will go off the board every once in a while, and you kind of wonder what the hell they were thinking. But James Hagens, for example, is a guy who a year ago, some thought could be the number 1 overall pick in this draft. Every mock, a lot of rankings that I see, Hagens has fallen into the 5-6 range. There's talk about if he's there at 6, could the Flyers pass up on Hagens? Anthony said over on Snow the Goalie that they like Jake O'Brien more than they like James Hagens. Has there been that kind of volatility to this? It feels like the only guy that everybody seems to believe is number 1 is Schaefer. Misa should be number 2. And then there's an ever-evolving group. I certainly don't remember Brady Martin being a name that was being thrown around as somebody who could be a top 8 pick. Now I'm starting to see his name pop up more. Can you speak to that at all? Does it feel like this group has been kind of in flux a little bit more than normal?
I think there's probably about, if you want to look at it from 3 through 7 or 3 through 8, there's probably about 10 or 12 guys that realistically I could envision going in those spots. Some of them would be a little bit of a surprise to those on the outside. Some of them, make sense. And I think you take a guy like James Hagens, Jake O'Brien, who you mentioned, Brady Martin, Anton Frondell, Caleb Denwye, Porter Martone, Radim Murtka, the big defenseman, I think also deserves being mentioned in that range. And I think you could see, I could see the Chicago Blackhawks sitting at 3 and saying, we've got our all-world center, the guy we believe is going to be the next big thing in Connor Bedard. We need to put some size on the wing next to him. And Porter Martone is far and away the best power forward in this year's draft. Let's get him, and let's let those guys kind of start building their chemistry, because I don't know how many of these guys are NHL ready, plug and play next season. But I think when you look at the position and you look at the size on Porter Martone at 6'3" and over 200 pounds, he's got the NHL size. His skating has improved. And if you're putting him on the wing, you're not really needing him to do a lot of the 200-foot work that a center would have to do. So you could sort of, I don't know if hide him is the right word, but you can sort of protect him a little bit and use him in advantageous positions. And the thought of Bedard and Martone together, it's pretty tantalizing. Now, I can also see them trying to build depth through the middle with Bedard on line 1, maybe a player like Anton Frondell on line 2, or Caleb Denwye, who, both of those guys project to be more 200-foot players, more cut from the Alexander Barkov, Jonathan Taves sort of model, where they're not going to be flashy, take it, go end to end, beat all 5 guys on the other end like we've seen Connor McDavid do, more along the lines of more of a workman-like, but they'll still produce offensively as well as be able to eventually check the other team's best players. And then you stack your lines that way and you build some depth. So and that's going to be the option for a lot of teams. I think at number 4, Utah sort of is in the same boat. They've got some talent through the middle. Do they look to build on the wing? Do they look to build on the back end maybe a little bit? Or do they kind of try to stack centers? It's an interesting place to be. The Flyers, again, are sort of in the same bubble. If you look, Travis Konechny, Matvey Michkov, Tyson Forrester, Owen Tippett, you sort of seem to have your, line one, line two wingers kind of established, but you don't have a lot in the middle right now. Nothing against Sean Couturier, Noah Cates, but they're not your building block number one center types. And I think, as you said, an O'Brien or a Hagens or someone along those lines could fill those roles in a little bit of a better way than what they have now.
So, like, let me lay this one out for you, because this is something that it feels like people have been kind of up in arms about. And I know this might be surprising to you, but Flyers Twitter doesn't agree unanimously on things. And I happen to spend probably more time on Flyers Twitter than I should. If Martone were to fall, say he's there at 6, and the Flyers have a bunch of wings, they don't have a lot of center depth. Is Martone the best player at 6? Like, let's just imagine that Schaefer's off the board, Mises off the board. Maybe Hagens gets taken, Denoye gets taken, Frondl gets taken. And then you're sitting there at 6, Martone is there, or like a Jake O'Brien. If you're the Flyers and you're evaluating this, or even just from your own evaluation, like, is O'Brien or Martone better set to make an impact sooner? Or do you think they're both on about the same timeline?
Well, no, if you're talking about who could potentially play in the NHL next season, I would say Porter Martone.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that 5 years from now, Jake O'Brien wouldn't be the better player. And I don't know. In 5 years, Porter Martone could be the better player. I don't know. But you're not drafting whoever the Flyers draft. I would have to assume at number 6 is not someone they're looking to pencil right into their lineup opening day next season. I don't think that player, even Matthew Schaefer, I don't know if he's 100% ready to plug and play into the NHL. He played 17 games this season in the Ontario League. I think if you count what he did at the Hlinka tournament in August, what he did in the OHL, World Juniors, and the Top Prospects game, he played 26 games this season. I don't know if that guy is immediately what you want to just throw right into an NHL lineup at 6'10" and 190 pounds, a shade under 190 pounds. So, I don't know how many of these guys are plug and play NHL ready, but you're not drafting for that. You're drafting for 3, 4, 5 years down the line. To me, if I'm the Flyers and that's the options available to me, then I think the pick has to be Jake O'Brien, because when you look at what they're going to need, what they need now, and what they're still going to need 3 years from now. I mean, look, Jack Berglund, I really like him. From what I've seen of him, he looks like a guy that if his skating can catch up with all of his other physical gifts, he's a guy who could be a 2-3 center and a really, really good one. I know a lot of people probably haven't seen him play because he's overseas in Sweden, but I have gotten the chance to see him when he came over earlier in the season. Had he not broken a knuckle on his hand in the last game before World Juniors, he would have had a major role on that Sweden team. And maybe he could have been a guy who was a difference in them getting a medal or not. Would have loved to see him, and I know the Flyers would have loved to see him in that role. But he's a guy who I think can be really good. Jet Luchenko, again, made the NHL team as an 18-year-old, which nobody really expected. The runway is going to be a little bit longer for him to see if he can do it again. I don't think in an ideal world, he won't have to go back to junior. He certainly won't have to go back to Guelph. But there's decisions that they're going to have to make there. So,
I'm not very bullish. I'm not very bullish on Luchenko. I think anything that you can get from him that's above like a 3C-ish from him in like the next 5 years is probably okay.
I think
I didn't love that pick at the time, but I could be wrong.
I think with Luchenko, someone has to get through to him that he needs to shoot the puck more.
Yeah.
If he does that, everything else in his game is A+. Skating, vision, playmaking ability, it's all A+. Like when I did my mock draft last year, he was a top 20 guy. I thought 13 was maybe a little bit early, but I wasn't like, oh my God.
You weren't offended.
Yeah, right? Like I said, okay, this is, this is one of those, you really like the player, let's just take the player. Because maybe he won't be there, later on. Let's just take the guy we like. So, and again, not a lot of guys from last year's draft class played in the NHL right away, and Luchenko did. And he'll have a chance to do it again next year. I think he just needs to shoot the puck more. I think that's sort of been proven. Every coach he's ever played for has talked about that. But I still think the need there is at center. And if you're talking,
let's actually go from there. So, of guys that could potentially, because there is so much flux, the centers who could potentially be on the board at 6, assuming that they stay at 6, which we'll get to that scenario in a little bit. Hagens is the smallest of the centers that could likely be there at 6. So you've got Hagens, Denoyer, O'Brien. I don't know. Brady Martin, again, is like a name that keeps popping up. I don't know if the Flyers would really make that jump at 6. But like, if you had to compare those guys and their comps, their skill sets, for the people who haven't had a chance to watch those guys play, who stands out the most to you? Who's the guy that you think maybe even like in the Tocchet system or something like might make the best impact, maybe is the best fit for this team?
Well, I think, we did our mock drafts coming out of the NHL scouting combine last week, and I had James Hagens going at number 6 to the Flyers because I think there's a lot of, and I want to make sure I say this the right way. From a physical development size, you mentioned Hagens' size. He reminds me just from a body type of Jack Hughes, where he's on the shorter, maybe a little bit physically underdeveloped side. And that's why I said, he needs another year of college. And I think maybe in hindsight, Jack Hughes probably could have used a year of college hockey to build up his body, because that's the great thing about college hockey. You only play on the weekends, and you have every other moment in the day when you're not in class or studying to be in the gym, getting bigger, getting stronger. It's only a benefit. And I think you've seen that with Hagens in his draft year as he's gotten bigger and stronger. And there's still another, level for him to go. But I think when he hits that full physical maturity, quote unquote, man strength, I think there's an 80-point guy there. I think there's a guy with top end skill set. Look, he was a point a game player as one of the youngest players in college hockey. And this is the difference between NCAA hockey and CHL hockey. Now, CHL hockey has all the hype behind it. Mm-hmm. But if you think about it, let's put James Hagens as a point per game player as an 18-year-old playing against 20, 21, and 22-year-old players. And let's switch him with Michael Misa, who's playing against 17, 18, and 19-year-old guys. And maybe Hagens is the guy with the 130-point season.
Sure.
I think you look at that. You look at Patrick Kane is sort of a really good, parallel for there, because Patrick Kane coming up through the national team development program where he's playing against older college competition in his draft, the year before he got drafted, he had an 80-point season in, a consummate amount of games. He goes to London in the Ontario League in his draft year, and he has, 130, 140 points. So when you're that good and you're playing a kid your own age, you can dominate a little bit differently. Doesn't mean one player is immediately going to be better than the other, but I think you have to take Hagens' numbers with a little bit of a grain of salt when you compare them to a Misa, because Misa's, just the level of competition is different. And then you take with Hagens, not only was he the number one center on one of the better teams in college hockey as a point-a-game player, he was the number one center on the World Junior team, again, as an 18-year-old, playing with two guys on NHL tracks and Gabe Perreault and Ryan Leonard, tied for the team lead in goals, and they won a gold medal. And he was, a driving force for them. So I think with James Hagens, there's I go back to, this is where I'm going to show my age a little bit, the 2009 draft, John Tavares draft.
Yeah.
People were hammering John Tavares because he can't skate. And I talked to one of the scouts I really trust who worked for Central Scouting at the time, and he said, "You've seen the guy for 3 years. The greatness is the norm. It's a guy who scored 72 goals as a 16-year-old. If he doesn't score 3 goals a game, you're marking him as a failure, right? You need to kind of stop looking for all the tiny little things he does wrong.
Yeah,
and I think you can over scout a guy, and I think that sort of kind of blends into what the great quote unquote scout grades are on Hagens, because you've seen him as a prime player for so many years now that you don't see the greatness or the top level because it's expected. You only see the flaws when he doesn't reach that level. So, look, people say Hagens is going to fall to 6. I could see Hagens going at number 2. I could see San Jose saying, this is the guy we really like, because Hagens projects to be a top-end guy. And that's not a knock on anyone else in this year's draft. That's just, how closely, grouped some of these players are, that there isn't a lot of difference between a Misa, a Hagens, a Frondel, a Denoyer, Martone, O'Brien, Martin. That's why I say there's 7 or 8 guys who could go in that very narrow range, and I wouldn't be all that surprised.
Well, I actually want to. All right, so let's dive into that one hypothetical real quick. In the whatever event, call it unlikely, call it potential, that San Jose shocks the world and they take Hagens at 2. Does Chicago run to the podium like from their war room? Like, did they immediately then take Misa? Because if not, does that then potentially open up the phone lines at 4? Like, so say Martone, they just, Chicago loves the idea of getting this big winger, right? Hagens is off the board, Martone is off the board, Utah's on the clock. Is that where you start getting 5, 6, 7 teams, including probably the Flyers at that point, making a call to try to move up to 4 to go snatch Misa?
Well, that's what, we talked to Danny, as you kind of alluded to earlier, and he said everybody's trying to move up. Everybody wants to move up because everybody, I think has their guy in mind. And again, because of the such a fine difference, if you find a guy that you really like and say, there's not much difference, but that guy's different, and that's the guy we need, and that's the guy we want, then yeah, maybe you will scramble and jump up. And I could see 3, I could see 4 being potential landing spots because, if you're Chicago, they've drafted a lot of guys. They've moved, I think they ended the season with 7 guys, 8 guys, 23 and under on their roster. And they might even have more than that next season. So at a certain point, you need to start adding to your NHL roster and stop building for the future. So maybe at 3, that becomes this place, something they can use to help them more in the now. And we know, and you can look at cap wages or whoever your favorite salary cap guru site is and say, oh, okay, these teams got a little cap issue. They have an RFA or a UFA they want to sign. Maybe we can do some business. And that, I think, starts as high as number 3. I think Bill Armstrong has come out and said, they've taken calls on number 4. I would assume, I spoke to Barry Trotz at the scouting combine. I would assume he's gotten calls on number 5. I'm sure Danny's gotten calls on number 6. Yep. So teams are looking to move up. It's just, how far are the teams in those spots willing to move back and still get a guy that they want, that they think can help them. So it's going to be, I think, between now and when the teams really set up shop for the draft, it'll be a little bit of a different experience here. I almost said when everybody gets to LA, because not everybody's going to LA. But when teams set up shop for the draft, I think you're going to see a lot of surprising / interesting moves. And the teams that are in those spots now, I don't know if all of them are going to be there when the dust settles.